Welcome. Today's online service is going to be different, and it's going to be directed to a much wider audience than usual. This past Monday, July 20th, my dad, Rudy Johnson, passed away. He woke up, read his Bible as he did every morning. Then he went outside for his usual 2 to 3 mile bike ride around the lakes where he lives. It appears that he made it a little less than a block away and began to not feel good, so turned around, and as he was walking back pushing the bicycle, he had a heart attack and passed away. There was no suffering. He died instantly. And as one of the family members said, taking a cue from Enoch, he said, Rudy walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. His sudden death was truly an answer to many prayers. I prayed for a long time that he have a speedy and painless transition to heaven, and God answered that prayer last Monday. Dad often said the number of people at your funeral will depend largely on the weather. But I'll be honest, he didn't even know anything about a COVID pandemic or anything like that. So for that reason, today we're just going to have a video tribute that can be shared around the world. Rudy Johnson was not only the husband to Lorraine for 67 years, 1 month, and 16 days, he was the father to Russell, Janet, and Kevin, the father-in-law to Beverly, David, and Diane, the grandfather to Brenda, Ryan, Kyle, Eric, Sean, and Ian, and the great-grandfather to 7 wonderful young ones who had the privilege of knowing their great-grandfather for longer than most. In addition, Rudy was the spiritual father and spiritual grandfather, mentor, pastor, and friend to thousands of people around the world. He was also the founding pastor of this church, and for that reason, today we will use this means for a brief tribute to his life and ministry. Our family has received literally hundreds of messages from people around the world, for which we are extremely grateful. Your words of encouragement have been used by God to comfort us and remind us of how blessed we've been to have Dad's legacy to reflect on. Many have asked about my mother, and I would like to report that God's mercy is at work even in her dementia. It has taken the edge off of the pain of their separation after a lifetime of blessing together. Today's musical selections will be very different than what we're used to. Dad was the only one in the family that was not a musician. To the best of my knowledge, he only sang one special in public after I was old enough to understand. The songs we've selected were the songs that he sang to himself or with the family while driving in the car or at other family gatherings, many times around the piano. Many of them you will not know, but as you listen to the words of the song, you will get a sense for what was important in his heart. Thank you for taking the time to reflect with us on a life well lived.
When my way groweth drear, precious Lord, lingered near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the shadows appear and the night draweth near, and the day is past and gone, my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
Dr. Rudy Johnson and his wife Lorraine were approved in May of 1958 to open the field of Peru for the Baptist Bible Fellowship. After deputation in language school, they arrived in Peru on July 6, 1960. During the next 16 years, they established their first church, and out of that church, 15 missions were started that later became churches. 2 of these churches have had record attendance of over 2,000. In 1965, the Bible Baptist Seminary was started and is still preparing Christian workers today. In May of 1976, the Johnsons returned to Miami, Florida, to begin the Spanish Bible Institute to train Spanish-speaking people in the U.S. to reach their own for Christ. They also started the Spanish Bible Baptist Church, which is now bilingual and called Global Church and pastored by their son Russell. During the early 80s, they worked with the missions office in Springfield, Missouri. They spent most of their time in missions conferences across the country in 198 churches. During these 3 years, over $6 million was raised for missions. In 1992, Rudy and Lorraine returned to Peru at the request of the Peruvian president and started a ministry to help over 200 national pastors and their churches. During this time, he pastored a church across the street from one of the major universities in Lima. They saw the congregation go from 17 to over 400, and a 5-story building was built. On July 5, 2000, God once again did a totally unexpected thing. He called Rudy and Lorraine to one of the most unique cities on earth, Cusco, Peru. They started a church in Cusco and then moved their ministry to Pisac, a city 20 miles away. This is where they opened their camp, Tambo de Gozo. They, along with their team, opened a sports ministry in several public schools, a radio broadcast, a bilingual elementary school, and hosted many groups and pastors' conferences for training at the camp. They also had their most successful outreach called Open Doors. They had over 1,000 on 5 different occasions with a high attendance of 1,519. In October of 2010, the Johnsons were invited to the first church they started, which was celebrating their 50th anniversary. There were several highlights during the week, but one of the greatest was when they recognized 44 pastors and many of their wives that are out of the church and are now serving around the world. After leaving BSUC and officially retiring as missionaries, Rudy spent the last 3 years focusing his attention on taking care of Lorraine, who faithfully stood by him and served with him all those years, but has been suffering from dementia. Rudy's passion has always been for God's work around the world, and in the last year he found a project close to his heart, helping pastors and churches in Venezuela. Charlie Arce, missionary to Venezuela, was actually led to the Lord by Rudy in Peru and was the first graduate of the seminary. This project also partnered the Johnsons with Gail Gonzalez and her husband Renee. She was a single missionary that worked with them many years ago in Peru. To date, they have coordinated churches and sent almost 500 boxes to Venezuela with food, clothes, shoes, glasses, medicine, and much more. My grandfather Rudy loved his family, the Word of God, living out God's purpose for him, inspiring churches to get involved in missions, and sharing the love of God with everyone.
Your perception of Dad is probably shaped by the stage of life when you met him. But take it from those of us who knew him best. He was always consistent. Dad lived his life according to values he believed in more than norms that others set for him. His values were often summarized in short statements. Most were probably not original, but he made them his own. These were the things that I have heard all of my life. And I have seen them, not just heard them. He said, when you preach, make it simple so people can understand, and make it biblical so that God can bless it. Dad was never complicated in his teaching. It was always very simple, but it was based in God's Word, the Word that he read, that he put in his heart, that he stored in his heart every day of his life. He also said, when you teach, give them something for their head, something for their heart, and something for their hands. He said, give them something to know, something to feel, and something to do. I always thought that was just oversimplification. And as we all tend to complicate things, I went through a phase where it was probably far more complicated than that as I prepared my sermons. But then I began to see and listen as men that I admired shared what they thought the secret to preaching and teaching was all about. And it's amazing how it boiled down to something for the head, something for the heart, and something for the hands. He always told me, treat everyone equal. Treat the doorman as well as you treat the president of a company. Someday, you may need the doorman to help you get to the president. In these days, when inequality seems to be such a big thing in every level of society, this truth still rings true. We need to treat everyone the same way, with the same respect. And that is something I remember learning as a child, to respect no matter who it was, no matter what social status they were from. Treat everyone the same. As I grew older and began pastoring, I remember him telling me, he said, every church is a body, and every transplant has a great chance of rejection. He said, hire from within the body. Growing up on the mission field and growing up where there wasn't a lot of places to get workers from other places, he always focused on raising up leaders, not hiring leaders from somewhere else. And after 40 plus years of ministry, I see the wisdom in that. And I see the problems that arise when those principles are not followed. He always said, you are what you reproduce. Nothing more, nothing less. And as I look around the world at the people that I know that grew up under his ministry, taking the very simple book, the master plan of evangelism, and building men the way Jesus built his 12, I can truly say he was right. You are what you reproduce, nothing more, nothing less. He always said, you're never too old to learn something new. That was an amazing thing about Dad. I've been with Dad to conferences that I wasn't sure about at times, and yet he was right there with me. Even into his 70s and 80s, he was learning new things and applying them where he could. He couldn't do everything, but he certainly was open to learning new things all the way to the very end. He also taught me, he said, never criticize what God is blessing. You know, from his background, he came from a background where people could be very critical about people that didn't do things their way. And yet Dad always said, but if God is blessing them, let's just let God sort that out. Important things to learn. He always told me, if you can't trust someone's word, you won't be able to trust anything else about them either. Wow, that's something to focus on a while. That is why in raising us as his children, the greatest thing that would get us in trouble was lying. Because if he couldn't trust our word, he couldn't trust anything else. He said, if you want to know what's in a person's heart, see where they spend their money. He took it very serious, the words of Jesus. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And as he talked about these things and he would ask questions whenever we were trying to decide who to help, who to support, who we should get behind in these things, he would always say, what are they doing? What are they giving? What is in their heart? See where they put their treasure. Toward the end of his life, in fact, it was after he arrived here from Peru on his retirement, he said, when it's all said and done, God and family are what matter most. God and family are what matter most. In the last few days, I've been hearing from different people, again, sharing with me their impressions of Dad's life and the impact it's had on them. And there seem to be three things that I hear over and over again. And it goes along with these three principles. It said, you can never outgive God. He had this little illustration that he used a small cup, a medium cup, and a large cup. And he constantly talked about, how do you want to be blessed? Well, it depends which cup you give God. Whatever cup you give him, that's what he can fill up with blessings. You can never outgive God. He always tried to be a blessing wherever he was, wherever you are. And I'll be honest, Dad in his 80s, it was very different than Dad in his 30s and 40s. But in our church, as I know he did in churches in Peru, he would always walk up to someone and stick his hand in his pocket and pull out a little billfold that he had, a little coin purse from Peru, and he'd pop it open and he'd say, "Do you want a beauty pill?" And he would hand out these little cinnamon candies to people and beauty pills. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say this week something to this tune. Our church is going to get a lot uglier now that we don't have someone handing out beauty pills every week. And the final thing is Dad and his flashlights. Maybe you saw one of his messages with flashlights. He had an assortment. He always carried at least one, and sometimes 3 or 4. I've seen him get up to preach and have at least 10 or 12 in his coat pocket. And it was all based on this simple words of Jesus. Let your light so shine that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Lest you elevate Dad to sainthood, I also want to remind you that he frequently said, in X number of years of marriage, my wife and I have never once talked about divorce. Murder? Yes. Divorce? No. In everything about Dad, there was always room for humor. And that was just part of who he was.
The chimes of time ring out the news, another day is through. Someone slipped and fell. Was that someone you? You may have longed for added strength, your courage to renew. Do not be disheartened, for I have news for you. It is no secret what God can do, what He's done for others, He'll do for you. With arms wide open, He'll pardon you. It is no secret what God can do. There is no night, for in His light you'll never walk alone. Always feel at home wherever you may roam. There is no power to conquer you when God is on your side. Just take Him at His promise. Don't run away and hide. It is no secret what God can do, what He's done for others, He'll do for you. With arms wide open, He'll pardon you. It is no secret what God can do.
Psalm 37 is one of those psalms that I've heard all of my life. It's a wonderful psalm. It contrasts the life and fate of the wicked with that of the righteous. We could teach an entire series of sermons on the great lessons that we find in this psalm. However, in the context of today's topic, I would like to focus just on verses 3 through 5. Why? Because those are the verses that my father chose to base his contract with God upon. Please pay attention to a portion of an interview that Pastor Guy Melton of Oasis Church did with my dad exactly 1 year ago this week.
Last week I saw your son Russell, and he mentioned to me, as we were talking about you coming this week, he mentioned a contract. He said you should ask him about it. A contract that you made with God many years ago. Share with that what that contract was.
In February of 1958, I went to Jacksonville, Florida, where I was my last year at BBC studying to be a missionary. And my pastor brought a message on signing a contract with God. He said, everybody that means business should find your contract. Said there's more than 2,000 of them in the Bible. And he said, when you find yours, you'll know it. So I started looking for my contract with God. That was in February. And in May, the month, in fact, the week that I was approved to open the field of Peru, I went down to a little park that's near the college. It was drizzling rain. Lord Janet was born the next week, so Lorraine was home resting. And I put my Bible on the steering wheel, and I started reading and looking. I wanted to find my contract. And I found these words: trust in the Lord and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord, and trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. And I knew that was it. That was mine.
What's the address? What verses? Because someone may want to write that down. What verses?
In Psalm 37.
37, what verse?
2, 3, and 4. Or
2, 3, and 4, if you want to write
3,
that
4,
down.
and 5.
Psalm 37.
And so I realized then that was my contract. And I said, Lord, now I'm going to ask 3 things of you. I'd already thought this through. I knew where I wanted to go. I said, first of all, I want a family that I can be proud of. I want a family that I can be proud of. Second of all, I want a work that is so big that nobody will ever say it was mine. It has to be God. And the third thing I said, Lord, I want to have fun. I want to have friends. I want to enjoy all this. And I want to have a lot of friends. That's all I asked for.
And God granted his part.
And everything else has come out of that.
I don't know how many times I've heard Dad explain these verses. And today, I will simply try to bring to light once again the truths that he lived by. Verse number 3 says, trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. In this verse, God asks of us 2 simple things. Number 1, to trust in him, and number 2, to do what is right. That means that at every crossroads in life, at every choice that we have to make, no matter how many times it happens in a given day, we have to ask ourselves, am I going to trust in myself, or am I going to trust in God? And God says, trust in me. Second, am I going to do what's right, or am I going to do what's wrong? You and I both know that that is a moment-by-moment decision that we have to make. At so many levels of life, it's not just in the big things. It's in the everyday things. It's in the public. It's in the private moments. It says, trust in the Lord and do good. And if you do that, if you will do those two things, God says that He would make sure that you had a place to live, and as Dad would say, and food to eat. Now, I realize that in other translations it talks about that we will be able to feed off the truth and everything like that, and that is fine. That is true also. But Dad always said, if I will just trust in the Lord and I will do good, He will make sure that I have all the basics, a place to live and food to eat. And I'll be honest, someone said this week, he never was attached to anything, but he never had a lack of anything either. Verse number 4. Says, delight thyself also in the Lord, and He shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Delight. That means to enjoy, to have fun, to do something because you want to, not just because you have to do it. Delight. I found so many times in the Bible that David said that he would delight in God's word, that he would delight in His commands. And you know, when you enjoy doing something, when you find delight, it's just simply not a burden. I don't think anyone can deny that Dad enjoyed what he did. No matter where he was, he enjoyed it. He had fun and delighted in everything he did, everywhere he went. I don't know how many times myself or my children or my siblings have run into someone or been somewhere where Dad had been previously and hear them make this remark. Do you know what your father or grandfather said or did while he was here? And we've all just learned to shake our head and say, there's no telling. Why? Because he delighted himself in the Lord and in everything he did. If we delight, God says He will give us the desires of our heart. Now, I want you to know something. Dad had a very, very big heart. Dad had a very vivid imagination for asking God. And he was a living example that nothing was too big. Nothing was too difficult for God. He had God-sized plans and he had God-sized dreams until literally the very end of his life. He always thought in big terms. How could he get more churches, more people involved in doing bigger and better things for the work of the Lord? There is nothing, listen to me, there is nothing that we can't ask God to do that He won't do it if it's really what's best for us. So many people, I talk about some of the projects Dad was involved in and the successful projects. But I know some of the projects that didn't work out. I remember Dad working a couple days on a project and God just doing amazing things. And in 2 or 3 days, a project for someone else that completely came together and just watched literally thousands of dollars pour into that other ministry. But I've also seen him launch out on doing things and God was just silent. And he would stop and say, well, I guess God knows that's not what's best, and walk away and keep going. The reality is, I always was the beneficiary of what we called God winks. In other words, when God went above and beyond what we could ask or think. And that was always right in line because God delighted in us as we delighted in Him. Verse number 5 says, "Commit thy way unto the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass." In other words, turn everything over to God. That means every positive situation, give it to Him. Every negative situation, give it to Him. Let me tell you, along the way, I remember much opposition that my father received all along his journey. And I also remember he would always take that and just give it to the Lord. And I watched God take care of things and just remove them out of the way many times, or just make them of such little importance that it just didn't get in the way. Commit your way to the Lord. Give it over to Him. But it says trust in Him. That takes us back to verse 3. It says trust in the Lord. Trust in Him. In other words, God has our best interest at heart, so we can trust Him. God is a good God. God is a sovereign God. He is a just God. He is a loving God. He's a merciful God. We can trust Him with literally every single detail of our life. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. God will make everything happen that He knows needs to happen. I've seen God do some amazing things. I've seen God bring people into a situation when Dad didn't have anything. I've seen Him bring people that had everything he needed and just put it in his lap. Why? Because he committed his way to the Lord. He trusted also in Him, and God brought it about. Dad came to the end of his life. It ended sudden. It was an answer to prayer. Someone was describing the last few moments this way. Again, another family member. And said, more than likely, Rudy got on his bike and he just started pedaling and talking to God. When he didn't feel good, he turned around, started pushing back toward the house, and continued talking to the Lord, and then looked up and said, "Oh Lord, you're here." This last song is so important to all of us. It just says, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Turn your eyes. Why? Because it will be worth it all when we see Jesus.
Oftentimes the day seems long, our trials hard to bear. We're tempted to complain, to murmur and despair, but Christ will soon appear to catch His trials will seem so small when we see Christ. One glimpse of His dear face, all sorrow will erase. So bravely run the race till we see Christ.
Life's day will soon be o'er, all storms forever past. We'll call